At about 5 p.m. on November 1st, 1996, 52-year-old Gary Triano stood on the 18th green at the La Paloma Country Club in Tucson, Arizona. Gary crouched down to line up a short putt, while three of his friends stood off to the side, giving him a hard time for taking so long. Gary just blocked them out. Almost everywhere else, Gary was known for being loud, impulsive, and never slowing down. But on the golf course, he always felt calm and focused. Gary stood back up and prepared to take the shot. He took a breath, brought his putter back just a little, and swung. His friends shouted like that might knock the ball off course, but Gary watched it roll across the green and drop right into the hole. Gary let out a huge yell and thrust his fist into the air in celebration. He turned to his friends and looked at them like they were crazy to think they could beat him. Gary grabbed the ball out of the hole, slipped his club into his golf bag, slung it over his shoulder, and then followed his friends into the country club bar. It was a few days before Gary's 53rd birthday, and he thought there was no better way to celebrate than with a round of golf and a drink with his friends. But what Gary didn't know was that this golf game was actually part of a bigger plan. Gary's girlfriend had arranged this game with his friends, and she'd gotten some other friends to invite him out to a different bar at 6 p.m., all so she could get Gary's house ready for a huge surprise party she was throwing him later that night. Gary and his friends took a seat at the bar and ordered some drinks. And as they did, they all bragged about the best shots they had made that day. The bartender handed Gary his drink, but before he could take a sip, he heard someone calling Mr. Triano behind him. Gary turned, and he saw a young woman in her mid-20s coming his way, and his face just lit up. It had been years since he had last seen her, but he recognized her immediately. She was one of his daughter's friends from when they were young. Gary stepped away from the bar, and the young woman hugged him like she was hugging her own father. Gary asked how she was doing, and he wanted to know all about her life. The two talked for a few minutes while Gary's friends drank at the bar. They were all very used to hearing somebody call out Gary's name no matter where they went, because it seemed like everybody in Tucson knew him. And in truth, Gary was really well known around the city. He had been a big-time real estate investor, he'd opened casinos, and he'd run businesses in a bunch of different industries. And before he'd gotten divorced from his second wife, a socialite named Pamela Phillips, they ran in the same circles as Hollywood celebrities and well-known politicians. The young woman hugged Gary again and said how great it was to see him, and she went outside as Gary made his way back to the bar. He glanced at his watch. It was almost 5:30, and so it was just about time for him to head to the next bar to meet his other group of friends. So he threw back his drink and then reached into his pocket, pulled out several bills, and carefully folded them into little origami flowers. He put these flowers on the bar for a tip, then grabbed his golf bag, shouted goodbye to everyone, and walked out. Gary's friends waved him off and then just kind of shook their heads. Gary couldn't help himself. He always had to make a grand exit. The sun was setting when Gary stepped outside, and so he looked out at the pink and red sky over the mountains and desert in the distance. It was a beautiful day, just about 70 degrees Fahrenheit, and Gary smiled. It was perfect days like this that had helped the Tucson real estate market boom, and Tucson real estate had once made him millions of dollars. But now, standing there, thinking about his money, all he could do was laugh, or he'd just get depressed. Despite the continued growth of the real estate market, the last few years had been tough on Gary financially. He had spread himself too thin, investing in too many high-risk ventures, and some of the deals he'd made had completely fallen apart and cost him a huge chunk of his fortune. In order to deal with these massive losses, Gary had recently filed for bankruptcy, and now he was slowly trying to rebuild his wealth. But Gary quickly shook all of this off. From the time he was a young man, he had really believed that no matter what happened to him, he would always land on his feet. And even though he was not making the kind of money he'd made in the past, and his life wasn't as exciting as it was when he and his socialite ex-wife were hanging out with famous people, Gary still just loved being here in Tucson. He traveled all over and gone to lavish parties in some of the biggest cities in the world. But at the end of the day, nothing could beat a perfect Arizona sunset over the mountains and the desert. Gary walked across the country club parking lot to his 1989 Lincoln Town Car. He tossed his golf bag in the back and got into the driver's seat. He was about to take off when something caught his eye. There was a small wooden box in the floorboard of the passenger seat. His girlfriend must have gotten him an early birthday present and somehow hidden it in the car without him noticing until now. Gary smiled, reached down, and grabbed the box. As Gary was getting into his car, the bar inside the country club was getting louder. More people had just come in from the golf course, and everybody was talking and laughing. But suddenly, a huge bang echoed over all that noise. The glasses behind the bar rattled, and some people hit the floor, trying to take cover. They had no idea what was happening. A nearby transformer might have blown, or they could be in the middle of an earthquake. Nobody knew. But one man at the bar, who happened to be a doctor, took off running towards the parking lot, and Gary's friends and some others followed. And when they got outside, they felt like they had just stepped into a war zone. Car alarms blared, they saw smoke rising into the air, they saw cars with shattered windshields, and they saw a Lincoln Town car with its windows blown out, its doors shredded, and its roof completely ripped off. The doctor ran right to that car, hoping that nobody was inside. But as he got closer, he could see a man sprawled out in the front seat, and most of this man's clothes had been torn off his body, and he looked burned and bloody. The doctor turned around and shouted for the people who had followed him to call 911 and to stay back. He didn't know if they were all still in danger, and even if they weren't, he didn't want anyone to see what he was looking at inside of that car. The doctor leaned in through the space where the car window used to be. He reached down and grabbed the man's bloody wrist. The explosion that had shaken the bar inside must have killed this man instantly. Detective James Gamber of the Pima County Sheriff's Department was clearing the dinner table and putting dishes in the sink at his house when his phone rang. He walked across the kitchen and answered it. It was one of his colleagues from the Sheriff's Department, and this colleague said that there had just been an explosion at La Paloma Country Club, and Gamber needed to get down there right away. So Detective Gamber ran out to his car and sped off through his residential neighborhood. Gamber had only been a homicide detective with the Sheriff's Department for a short time. In fact, he had only worked one homicide case at this point. But as he drove to the country club, he had no idea if he was even heading to the scene of a murder. For all he knew, the explosion he was racing towards could have been caused by an accident of some kind. A few minutes later, Gamber pulled into the La Paloma parking lot, and he saw first responders everywhere. He also saw a different group of people, many of them in golf clothes, standing with two police officers near the main entrance of the club. The detective got out and walked over towards the first responders, and as he did, the scene in the parking lot almost didn't seem real to him. He stepped over shattered glass, and he thought he saw a car windshield stuck up in a tree, and when Gamber got to the car where the majority of first responders were and he looked inside of it, he knew he was not dealing with an accident. There was no doubt in his mind that a bomb had gone off in that car. Gamber stared down at the mangled body in the front seat. He glanced over at the first responders, and even they looked completely shaken. They had seen people who had been pulled from fires, but none of them had seen a man who had been killed by a bomb. The detective looked back at the body, and he saw something that just seemed odd. It looked like this man's clothes had been ripped off by the sheer force of the blast, but his watch had stayed on his wrist. So Gamber leaned further into the car to get a better look. The glass on the man's watch had cracked, and the watch had stopped at 5:38. And Gamber couldn't really explain it, but seeing the watch really hit him hard. It was like this man's last moment on Earth was frozen in time. Gamber stepped away from the car and walked over to the crowd of people standing out front. He briefly spoke to the other officers, and then he started taking statements from everyone. And almost all of them knew the dead man in the car, and they said his name was Gary Triano. Detective Gamber continued to gather information on Gary from the people at the club, and he learned a little about Gary's current girlfriend and what people called Gary's larger-than-life attitude. As Gamber wrote everything down in his notebook, he heard sirens blaring and cars and vans speeding down the street towards the parking lot. He looked out onto the street, and he quickly realized this case was about to get a lot bigger than anything he'd ever worked on. Because most of the vehicles heading this way did not belong to the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the local police. They belonged to the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. And within minutes, Gamber watched as federal agents from the FBI and ATF swarmed the parking lot and took control of the crime scene. After Gamber finished his interviews, he walked away from the club entrance, but he hung back and just watched the activity in the parking lot. This crime scene had overwhelmed him when he arrived, and now there were law enforcement officers from multiple agencies searching the lot, and forensics and explosives experts from the ATF and FBI searching Gary's car. Gamber honestly wasn't sure what he was supposed to do. Finally, amidst all of this, he spotted his boss, the Pima County Sheriff. So he weaved his way past federal agents towards Gary's car and approached the sheriff, who looked kind of overwhelmed himself. The sheriff told Gamber that several of the federal agents he'd spoken to thought there was a chance that this had been a professional mob hit. Technicians had already found fragments in and around the car that they believed were from a homemade incendiary device, and they thought this device could be the type of bomb often used by the mafia. This actually all made sense to Detective Gamber because he knew that the mafia had been prevalent in this area since back in the 1970s. But Gamber wanted to know what their department's role was in all of this. Clearly, the FBI and ATF were running things here, and if the mafia was involved, both of those agencies would probably run the entire case for a while. The sheriff said their department would coordinate with the feds, but he told Gamber that it was still the homicide unit's job to pursue this like they would any other murder case. So Gamber told his boss if the FBI and ATF were going to start looking into big-time suspects like organized crime families, then he wanted to start on a much smaller scale. And right now, that meant talking to the person who would almost always be the first suspect in a murder investigation, the victim's romantic partner. A little over an hour after the explosion, a woman stepped out of her car and approached the country club parking lot. She looked almost like she was sleepwalking, like she didn't see all the chaos around her. Local police officers immediately stopped the woman from walking any further into the parking lot, and she shouted that she was Gary's girlfriend. Detective Gamber saw this happening. He'd been waiting for her. A police officer had called her at Gary's house to inform her about what had happened. At first, she didn't believe the cop. She said Gary was out with his friends, and then he was going to come home for a huge surprise party she was throwing him. But eventually, she had accepted the truth, and she said she was coming to the country club right away. Gamber rushed over to her and introduced himself. He said how sorry he was, and he hated to put her in this position right now, but he needed to ask her some questions. Gary's girlfriend looked back at him, still with this glazed expression, and said she would try to help. Gamber glanced down at a few notes he'd scribbled in his notebook. He knew the doors on Gary's car had been so badly damaged by the blast that it was impossible to tell if someone had broken into the car to plant the bomb. But people had been in and out of the parking lot all day, and so far, nobody had reported witnessing a break-in. So, Gamber thought there was a good chance that whoever planted the bomb had easy access to Gary's car, so he asked Gary's girlfriend if she had keys to the Lincoln. She said she did, but she said it didn't really make a difference because Gary always left his car unlocked. This threw Gamber off. Somebody leaving their car unlocked, especially a nice car like Gary's, sounded like something that only happened back in the 1950s. But Gary's girlfriend said that he had this foolish belief that nothing bad would ever happen to him, and that people were actually good at heart. She said if it wasn't for her, he very likely would have just left his house unlocked every night. Gamber continued to talk to Gary's girlfriend for a few more minutes. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but this woman really did seem completely shocked by Gary's death. So he told her, before he let her go, that he just wanted to know if she could think of anyone in Gary's life who might have wanted to harm him. Gary's girlfriend shook her head. She said Gary had a good relationship with both of his ex-wives and his 2 grown children from his first marriage, and the children from his second marriage were still pretty little, and she said everybody who knew Gary loved him. He was generous and fun. Suddenly, Gary's girlfriend trailed off, and the look on her face totally changed, like she had just thought of something. Gamber asked if something was wrong, and she nodded. There was one past relationship in Gary's life that had ended badly, and it just continued to get worse. She said Gary had an ex-girlfriend named Robin Gardner, and Gary had left her when she got pregnant. But even before that, Gary had wanted to get out of the relationship because Robin had a temper and had once attacked him with a flower vase. Gamber asked if Gary had had any contact with Robin lately. Gary's girlfriend said that Robin had called a few months earlier, and she left Gary a message on the machine. And all Robin had said was, "You're going to pay. Someday, you're going to pay." The day following the bombing, FBI and ATF agents remained focused on possible mob ties to Gary's murder, while Detective Gamber drove to meet Gary's ex-girlfriend, Robin, at her house. By this time, the bombing was all over the news in the region, so Robin was well aware that Gary had died. Robin opened the door, holding her baby girl in her arms, and she led the detective into the kitchen, where her new husband was already sitting at the table. Gamber took a seat, and he didn't waste any time. He said he knew that Robin had once physically assaulted Gary because Gary had called 911 and asked police to remove her from his house. Gamber also knew about the threatening phone message she had left him. Robin's face immediately turned red, and she looked very embarrassed. She said she couldn't justify her actions, but Gamber clearly did not have the full story. When she had gotten pregnant, Gary had openly doubted that the baby was his. He broke up with her and didn't want any responsibility for the child, so she lashed out because she was hurt and scared and didn't know if she'd be able to provide for her baby on her own. But after the baby was born and a paternity test proved that she was Gary's daughter, Gary had said he would help take care of her financially, and Robin and Gary's relationship became a lot more civil. The baby started crying a little, and Robin asked if she could excuse herself. Gamber said of course, and Robin carried the baby out of the kitchen. Her husband watched to make sure she was out of earshot, and then he leaned toward Gamber and spoke quietly. He said there was no doubt that his wife had a temper. If Robin was mad, she made it really clear. But despite the issues she'd had with Gary, Robin's husband said that she told him that Gary was a good man for admitting he was wrong and doing his part to make sure the baby was taken care of. By the time Gamber left the house, he didn't feel like Gary's ex-girlfriend or his latest girlfriend were the likely killers. He didn't want to eliminate any suspects until he had more clear evidence, but he knew Gary's ex-wives and his grown children could also have a motive to kill Gary. And all of them most likely knew about Gary's strange habit of keeping his car doors unlocked, so they would know how easy it would be to place a bomb in the Lincoln town car. During the week following the bombing, Detective Gamber checked in often with the sheriff and with the FBI and ATF. The feds were still tracking leads connected to the mafia, and they were delving deep into Gary's financial records. It had become clear that Gary had racked up millions of dollars in debt, and he owed people money all over the world, so they were even following international leads. But all of the agencies believed Detective Gamber's investigation held just as much weight as theirs. It was still entirely possible that Gary's murder was personal and had nothing to do with his business dealings. So Gamber arranged separate interviews with Gary's two ex-wives, but both of these meetings played out almost exactly the same way. All Gary's first wife, Mary, and his second wife, the socialite Pamela, really told Gamber was that they loved Gary, thought he was a great father, and they had remained good friends with him after their divorces. They were also both heartbroken by Gary's death. After meeting Mary and Pamela, Detective Gamber did not feel like he had any new information about the case, and he was already starting to get frustrated. Gary's somewhat tangled romantic life had seemed like a strong lead, but his relationships with his ex-wives appeared to have both been pretty healthy. And even as Gary had started to struggle financially, he always paid his child support, so that was not a cause for conflict. And Gamber also had to admit that both women had really solid alibis. Neither of them had been in town when Gary died. Following the meetings with the ex-wives, Gamber interviewed Gary's son and daughter from his first marriage, who were both in their mid-20s, and he hoped they would give him something to go on. But they would both say that Gary was a great dad and an amazing friend. He meant everything to them. They admitted that when they were teenagers and their parents got divorced, they had blamed their dad at first, but they ended up loving their stepmom and their two little half-siblings, so any animosity they felt towards their dad had disappeared. And so in about the span of a week, Gamber had met with the people he believed had the clearest personal motives to kill Gary, but he felt like he still hadn't gotten anywhere. At the same time, the federal investigations also seemed to be stalling. There were plenty of leads, but each one of them fell apart under the slightest bit of scrutiny. So, as November came to an end, everyone involved in the hunt for Gary's killer worried that the case was already drying up, and that the killer, who had set off a homemade bomb in the city of Tucson, would remain free and out on the streets. In early December, about a month after Gary's murder, Detective Gamber got a phone call at his desk, and as soon as the man on the line began talking, Gamber could hear the urgency in his voice. The man said he was an investigator from Aspen, Colorado. He'd just seen a news report about Gamber's ongoing investigation, and he had some strange pieces of evidence that he thought might be connected to the car bombing. When Gamber heard this, he felt like he'd just woken up after a long night of sleep. This was the first time he'd been excited about this case in weeks. The Colorado investigator said he'd been working a fraud case for months, trying to track down a man named Ron Young. Ron had bilked a bunch of people out of thousands of dollars. And back in October, this investigator had found an abandoned minivan in California that Ron had rented. Inside the van, the investigator said he'd found a sawed-off shotgun. He'd also found some potential evidence that he didn't really understand at the time. But after seeing the news report about this car bombing, he thought that evidence he found might finally make sense. Gamber was now standing up at his desk, just waiting with anticipation to hear what this evidence was. The investigator said he had found a map of Tucson, Arizona, and a piece of paper with some names on it. And one of those names was Gary Triano. Gamber felt his hands shaking. He wanted to run out of the station and go find Ron Young right away. So he asked the investigator to please send over all the information he had on him. The investigator said he would do that as soon as they hung up, but he gave Gamber a warning. He said Ron was elusive, and tracking him down would not be easy. Throughout the end of 1996 and the first several months of 1997, Detective Gamber worked with the FBI to try to locate Ron. But after months of searching, Gamber started to feel like the investigator from Colorado had made a huge understatement. Ron was not just elusive, this man was a ghost. None of Ron's family or friends, or anyone he knew, seemed to have any idea where he was. He might as well have just dropped off the face of the earth. And even with Gamber and the FBI coordinating with state and local authorities across the country, they could not get a viable lead on Ron's location. During this time, the other aspects of the investigation had also hit a wall, and so even the federal agencies believed that finding Ron was their only real option for keeping the case going. But as more time went by and they still could not find Ron, Gamber started to get the sick feeling that Gary's killer would never be found and his family would never get closure. And for Gamber, who was still so new to the homicide unit, this felt like a total failure. And by early summer of 1997, about 7 months after Gary's murder, there was still no sign of Ron. And Detective Gamber's fears came true. The interagency task force that had been working on the case disbanded. The feds left, and Gary's murder was no longer considered a top priority for the Pima County Sheriff's Department. Gamber did his best to try to return to the case files whenever he could, but he soon had other homicide investigations to lead. And then Gary's murder almost completely disappeared from the news, and the case went cold for a very long time. On November 19, 2005, 9 years after Gary's murder, a chiropractor in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, came home after a day of work, sat down on his couch, and turned on one of his favorite TV shows, America's Most Wanted. At the time, America's Most Wanted was a very popular show that featured stories about criminals who were still at large, in the hope that the viewers of the show might provide tips that could help lead to an arrest. The chiropractor watched the show and listened to a story about a man who was wanted in a fraud case and had possible connections to a murder. And as the chiropractor watched, he suddenly got off the couch and got closer to his TV to make sure he was really seeing what he thought he was seeing. There was an image of the criminal on the screen. Now, the chiropractor didn't recognize the criminal's name, Ron Young, but he definitely recognized the man, because he had treated this man's bad back on several different occasions. The chiropractor grabbed his cell phone from his pocket and dialed the number for the America's Most Wanted tip line. 2 days later, federal and local law enforcement arrested Ron Young in Fort Lauderdale. And days after that, Detective Gamber, who was still a homicide detective, along with other Pima County investigators, flew to Florida to question Ron in connection to the bombing that killed Gary Triano. Detective Gamber felt exhilarated to have the case reopened. He had always regretted that he had not been able to bring Gary's killer to justice, but Gamber would soon realize that he still had a long way to go. Ron repeatedly denied having anything to do with Gary's murder, no matter how much police pressured him. And so it would take several more years of coordinated efforts between law enforcement organizations across the country and multiple international agencies for investigators to gather evidence to prove that Ron knew a lot more than he was willing to say, and that there was someone else out there on the run who was directly connected to Gary's murder. 4 years later, on a cold December night in Vienna, Austria in 2009, now 13 years after Gary's murder, members of Austria's federal police force approached an upscale hotel located in one of the wealthiest parts of the city. The lead officer and his partner found the room they were looking for and knocked on the door. When the door opened, the lead officer spoke in German, but the person at the door looked confused. So the officer quickly switched to English and asked them to identify themselves. And when the lead officer heard this person's name, he told them that they were under arrest for the murder of Gary Triano. Soon after this arrest, the lead officer contacted his supervisor, who then got in touch with federal authorities in the United States to start the extradition process. That process took months, but when the suspect was back in Arizona, Detective Gamber interviewed them. And by the time that interview ended, all of Gamber's hard work had finally paid off. After 13 years, he now knew who had murdered Gary. Based on evidence collected over the course of the entire investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Gary on November 1st, 1996. At around 4:15 p.m. that day, the bomber sat at a small table in a hotel room, breathing in slowly over and over until they could feel their heart rate slowing down. When they felt completely calm, they reached out, picked up the homemade bomb they had spent days putting together, and then slowly placed it into an open wooden box laying on the table. They secured the bomb inside the box and then walked across the room and grabbed the phone. They took a small piece of paper out of their pocket with a number scrawled on it and dialed. A friendly young man at the front desk of the La Paloma Country Club answered and asked how he could help. The bomber, using an equally friendly voice, asked the young man if Gary Triano was out on the golf course. The young man said he was. He said he had welcomed Gary into the club a little while earlier. After that, the bomber hung up the phone and walked back to the table, picked up the box with the bomb in it, and walked out to their car. They set the box in the passenger seat and then drove slowly down the road. No need to take any stupid chances by driving fast. A few minutes later, the bomber pulled into the La Paloma parking lot. They spotted Gary's Lincoln Town Car and pulled into a spot that was as far away as they could get while still maintaining a clear view of Gary's car. The bomber scanned the lot and they didn't see anyone. So they opened their car door, went around to the other side, and carefully picked up the box with the bomb inside of it. They kept their head down as they walked to Gary's car. When they got there, they saw that the passenger side door was unlocked. They opened the door, crouched down, and placed the box on the floorboard. The bomber closed Gary's car door and quickly walked back to their car and climbed inside. And then they watched and waited. At around 5:30 p.m., they saw Gary step out of the country club. The bomber reached into their pocket and slipped out a small remote control. As they watched Gary get closer to his car, their heartbeat got faster. Gary climbed into his car, and after a second, the bomber watched as Gary leaned down towards the floorboard. And at that moment, the bomber hit a button on that remote. The bomber heard a loud bang and saw the roof of Gary's car go flying into the air. In the chaos, the bomber sped out of the parking lot and drove to a nearby payphone. They dropped a coin in, and when the person answered, the bomber said the job was done. The person on the other side of the call didn't say anything. They just hung up the phone and smiled at their two little children who were playing nearby. Ron Young, the man who had eluded authorities for years before getting caught by a chiropractor watching TV, built the bomb and placed it inside of Gary's car. But Ron was not the person who had set any of this in motion. Gary's second wife, the socialite Pamela Phillips, was the one behind everything. It turned out that despite what Pamela had told the police, she was not happy about her relationship with her ex-husband. Because ever since Gary had begun experiencing financial difficulties, he stopped giving Pamela the type of money he had given her in the past. Gary still paid child support and alimony, but there was nothing extra for her like there used to be. And so Pamela had decided that the only way she could get the kind of money from Gary that she wanted was by killing him. Because Gary had taken out a $2 million life insurance policy, and he had made Pamela and his two kids the beneficiaries. But until those kids turned 18, Pamela would receive the payout if Gary died, with the understanding that she would manage and invest the money for the kids. But Pamela just wanted the money for herself and did not want to wait any longer. So she offered a man she'd once had a romantic relationship with, Ron Young, $400,000 to do the job. Ron already had a criminal past, and he had some experience with explosives. So together, Pamela and Ron started planning Gary's murder, and they decided to use a homemade bomb. And in the fall of 1996, they found the perfect way to carry out their plan. Gary's girlfriend had wanted everyone in Gary's family to come to the surprise party she was planning. So she had invited Pamela and the kids, and even told Pamela her plan to keep Gary out of the house. He was going to play golf at La Paloma until around 5:30, and then go to another bar before coming home. So, Pamela now had the perfect time and place for Ron to pull off the murder. She knew exactly where Gary was going to be, and she knew Gary never locked his car doors, so Ron would have no problem finding the car and planting the bomb. This all took years for Detective Gamber and investigators to put together, mainly because Ron had been so difficult to hunt down and to get any information from. But when they finally had him in custody and started getting closer to connecting Pamela to the murder, she took off to Europe. It took a while, but eventually, law enforcement agencies in Austria found her staying at a high-end hotel in Vienna. So they arrested her and sent her back to the United States. Ron Young and Pamela Phillips were both found guilty of murder and conspiracy. Ron received 2 life sentences without possibility of parole. Pamela received life in prison plus 25 years, also with no possibility of parole. And because of the amount of time this investigation took, it was both Detective Gamber's second homicide case and his last. He retired from the force not long after having helped solve Gary's murder. On Friday, August 21st, 2020, 58-year-old Aristides Polino was driving back to his home in Miami, Florida in his police SUV after completing a midnight shift. Aristides was a 25-year veteran of the Miami police force, and over the last 2+ decades, he had routinely done midnight shifts, so this was nothing new. When he got to his house, he parked his SUV in the driveway, and like always, he went right into his house. He didn't talk to his wife Clara or his son. He just went straight up to his bedroom and immediately fell asleep. About 4 hours later, at 5 p.m., Aristides woke up and he expected to hear his wife's voice somewhere in the house. So when he didn't, and the house was just totally silent, something told him that something was off. So he climbed out of bed, he put on his clothes, and he went downstairs to look for his wife. When he got down to the living room, he saw his son sitting on the couch, but he didn't see his wife. And so he asked his son, hey, have you seen your mom? And he would say, no, I haven't seen her. But sensing on his dad's face that something was wrong, he said, hey, I'll help you look for mom. And so the two men began searching the house, yelling out for Clara, and Aristides began calling his wife, but she wasn't picking up. And after several minutes, the two men reconvened in the living room, and they started going over whether or not she had told them about some appointment that day, and that would explain why she wasn't in the house. But after talking about it, they decided that she didn't have any appointments, and she should be home right now. And so the men decided, maybe she went outside and she's talking to a neighbor, or, she went for a walk and she's talking to somebody on the road. And so they decided they would go outside and search the outside of the property. When they got outside, Aristides went towards the back of the property and his son went towards the front, down towards the driveway. And so as Aristides is making his way around the back of the property, he hears his son scream out for help. Aristides comes running back around the property and he sees his son standing in the driveway with the door of his police SUV wide open. 4 hours earlier, after Aristides came home, he parked his police SUV right in the driveway like he always did, and for some reason he left the car unlocked. And so he goes in the house and he falls asleep. And while he was sleeping, Clara, who was home, she exited the house and walked down the driveway to his SUV. She opened up the door and went inside. It's believed she was looking for something, although we don't know what she was looking for. And while she was in the back of his car fishing around for whatever it was she was looking for, the door she had entered the vehicle in shut behind her. And because this is a police SUV, the back seat was designated for suspects, and so the back two doors did not open from the inside. And there was a very thick partition separating the back seat from the front seat, so Clara could not just reach over the seats and honk the horn to get someone's attention. And Clara did not have her cell phone, so she couldn't call anyone for help. And when she screamed out for help to somebody out on the road to help her, her screams were severely muffled, and the back windows of this police car were heavily tinted, making it extremely difficult to see that there was a person in the back seat of this car. So for 4 hours, Clara desperately screamed and kicked and punched and did everything she could to try to free herself from the situation she was in. All the while, the temperature inside the car continued to go up. The SUV was parked in full sunlight, no shade whatsoever, and the temperatures that day were over 90 degrees Fahrenheit. And so by the time Clara was ultimately discovered, the inside of that SUV had effectively become an oven. Aristides ran over to his vehicle and he pulled his wife out and he started doing CPR on her, but it was too late. She had died of heat stroke. Her death was ultimately ruled an accident. Our next story is called Molding Room. It was 2 days before Christmas in 2010, and 54-year-old Alan Catterall, along with his future son-in-law Mark, were sitting in the break room of a kayak molding facility in the United Kingdom where they both worked. And as they sat there drinking tea, they began exchanging notes about what gifts they got for the rest of their family for the holidays. And as they spoke, they both were very careful to keep their voices very quiet in fear that someone might overhear them, because Alan's wife and daughter also worked at this kayak company. Alan had worked for this company for 10 years, and even though it was back-breaking work a lot of the time, he loved it because it meant he got to spend all this time with his family basically 24/7. It was only 7 a.m., which meant Mark and Alan had just started their shifts, but they were already taking this break to talk about Christmas because they were so excited about it. But they finally said, okay, we do need to go to work, and so they put their cups in the sink, and then Alan made his way down to the factory floor, and his future son-in-law Mark made his way up to the control room. On the factory floor, where Alan was heading, was where all the special machinery was inside of these little rooms where the kayaks were actually molded and put together. And it was Alan's job to make sure the machinery was clean and operational. The machinery inside of these little kayak-making rooms was very customized and very finicky, and so Alan was one of the few people at the company who really understood what made it work and what would cause issues, and so he was very valuable at the company. That day, Alan knew one of the circuit boards for one of these molding rooms had shorted out, and so the leadership had decided to shut down that particular molding room while the circuit board was fixed. And so when Alan went down and began checking out each of these molding rooms, he knew which one had been shut down. So he knew when he went in there, it was not going to be operational. But when he went into that particular molding room, he noticed that it really needed a good clean. When these kayaks were made inside of these molding rooms, a lot of times the excess plastic would kind of seep out of the actual mold, and it would get caked to the walls, and it would flake all over the ground. And so periodically, Alan would clean these rooms, and he figured right now, with this one shut down, he might as well clean it. And so Alan grabbed a crowbar, and he headed into this shut-down molding room, and he got to work chipping all this plastic off the walls and making a big pile on the ground to sweep out and throw away. But as Alan chipped away at all the plastic, the doors leading into this molding room shut. And so suddenly Alan was cast into total darkness because his only light before that had been coming through these doors. But that was the least of Alan's worries. He knew that if these doors were shutting, these doors were automatic, that meant that the circuit board had to have been fixed, and they didn't know he was in here. And so now this molding room must be operational, which meant he only had minutes to get out of this room. And so Alan ran to the door, and with his crowbar, he began trying to pry the doors open, but he couldn't. These are mechanically sealed doors. They do not just open. You need to press a button to release them. But Alan's in a total panic. He knows what happens in this room, and he just can't get the doors open. And so he began banging on the door with his crowbar and screaming for anybody out in the factory floor to please stop this process that's surely starting inside of this room. Open these doors, get me out of here. But it was so loud out on the factory floor, nobody heard him. And so before long, Alan must have looked around and saw the walls inside of this tight, cramped space beginning to glow red. because this molding room was actually just an oven. It reached almost 600 degrees Fahrenheit in about 10 minutes. And so Alan is watching as this oven is restarting and he's sealed inside of it. And so the walls turned bright red, and then before long, the crowbar he was using to try to open the door must have become so hot he couldn't have held it, and then the ground as well would have been red hot, and his shoes would have begun to melt, and then the air temperature inside would have gotten so unbelievably hot he couldn't have breathed. And so screaming in pain and pounding on the door, leaving his skin on the door every time he hit it, Alan eventually just collapsed to the ground in unimaginable pain as he cooked alive. Finally, when Alan caught on fire and black smoke began coming off of his body and pouring out onto the factory floor, the factory realized there's a problem with this molding room, so they turned it off, they opened it up, and they discovered Alan. It would turn out, after Mark and Alan had chatted about Christmas in the break room and then parted and gone their own ways, Alan had gone down to the factory floor and inside of that molding room, and his future son-in-law, Mark, had gone up to the control room where he would have no visibility of the factory floor. All he had was this big switchboard full of lights and switches and gauges that controlled all of the molding rooms. And not long after he got up there and was looking at the control panel, he saw a blinking light come on. And it was for the molding room that Alan was working inside of. And that blinking light meant someone had fixed the circuit board, and so that molding room now had power. And so reflexively, Mark just turned it on. And when he did that, the molding room began its restart process, which included sealing its doors and turning on the oven. And inside of that molding room, there were no safety escapes. In fact, there was really no safety precautions at all with regards to these ovens. And so as soon as Mark flipped that switch, he had killed his future father-in-law. 5 years later, the Kayak Molding Company was convicted of corporate manslaughter and fined 200,000 pounds. Also, the man who actually designed these molding rooms with no safety precautions in mind, no emergency exits, nothing, he was fined 25,000 pounds and sentenced to jail for 9 months.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Within Reach.
On January 30th, 1925, a 37-year-old man named Floyd Collins walked through this huge forest in central Kentucky inside of a national park. As he walked along, his boots splashed in the melting snow and mud on the ground, and above him, all he heard was the sound of water dripping down amongst the leaves. It was warmer than it had been in several days, and so that was why Floyd was out here. He was trying to take advantage of the nice weather. And so after walking for a while on this muddy, slushy trail, the trees around Floyd began to thin out, and then eventually he reached the edge of the tree line, and in front of him was this huge clearing. Now, in this clearing, the trail he was on continued straight ahead, but it came to a stop in front of this huge cavern-like opening in the side of a hill. And so without hesitation, Floyd stepped out of the trees into the sunlight, and he walked the rest of the trail right up to the opening of this cavern, and he stopped and just stared and smiled. This cavern-like space on the side of this hill was the entrance to a cave known as Sand Cave. And Floyd had spent the last week coming out to Sand Cave and exploring the different tunnels, but today his plan was to go as deep and as far inside of this cave as he possibly could. Caves were a huge tourist attraction in this region, and Floyd was a very experienced caver who had been caving since he was 6 years old, and he knew that most of Sand Cave had not been explored. And so if he could go in there and explore all the different parts of the cave and map it all out and make sure it was safe, it was sure to be a huge moneymaker. He could bring people here and lead them on guided tours. So Floyd left the muddy path he had been walking on and stepped foot inside of this grand entrance to Sand Cave. It's basically this 250-foot wide cathedral-like space inside of this hill with ceilings high enough you could stand, but it's totally dark in there. And despite being this big open space, it very quickly funnels to this one kind of tunnel that goes straight down and connects to all these offshoot underground passageways, many of which have never been explored before. And so, as Floyd walked across this big open entryway, he lit his oil lamp and then began mentally preparing himself for what he was about to do, which was going to be very claustrophobia-inducing, even for a very experienced caver. And so Floyd reached the back of this huge entryway, and he reached this tunnel that would connect to the rest of the cave, and he began walking down it. And this tunnel was not very restricting. You could stand in it, you could move around in it, but it was very short. It was 15 feet straight down at an angle, where at the bottom of those 15 feet was a square hole in the ground. And Floyd, having been here the previous week, knew that once you go through this hole, the real caving begins. Now you're going to be down on your hands and knees, wriggling your way through these very tight and restricting areas where you don't really know where you're going, because again, a lot of this stuff has never been explored before. But this is why Floyd loved caving. He loved the adventure and the risk of doing things like this. And so Floyd got to this hole, he put his oil lamp down on the ground, he casually lowered himself feet first into this hole, which dropped down several feet, and then once he was on firm ground, he reached up, grabbed his oil lamp, and pulled it into the hole with him. Once he was inside of this lower level space, he crouched down and looked around, and off to his right was a tunnel that he could crawl through that seemed to lead to a series of other tunnels. And so he puts his lamp in front of him, he gets down, and he begins crawling through this tunnel. And after a little while, he reaches this kind of fork in the road where he had several options of very narrow tunnels to choose from. Now, the previous week, Floyd had gone down several of these tunnels and mapped out where they went, but there was one tunnel in particular at this fork that was very narrow. It was likely the most narrow of all the tunnels, but from where he had seen the last week, it looked like it went pretty far without obstruction. And so he immediately began going headfirst into this tunnel where he had no idea where it was going to go. Think about that. If you go headfirst into a tunnel and you get stuck, what are you going to do? You can't really go anywhere. So this guy is like totally fearless, just going headfirst into what most people would consider a nightmare scenario. And so the way Floyd would approach these very tight tunnels is he would put his oil lamp out in front of him, and then he'd keep his hands over his head, and he'd kind of wriggle his way head first and push his lamp along the way. And so that's what he did. He began going into this really restrictive tunnel. It's hard to breathe because the walls are so tight on his chest cavity. But as he's going, eventually the ceiling begins to slope upward just enough that he can pull himself up onto his hands and knees and kind of catch his breath. By this point, Floyd was approximately 55 feet underground. That's where this little pocket was, where he could get up on his hands and knees and breathe. And so from this position, he still could see with his lamp that this tunnel continued to snake further and further down, and his hope was that eventually it would lead to a big underground chamber that was not just big enough to go to your hands and knees on, but was big enough you could stand and walk around in, because those were the big tourist attractions. Not only because it seems like another world underground that you can fully explore and walk around in, but also, as Floyd knew from his past experience of going into other caves, a lot of times those big underground chambers are full of Native American artifacts. And again, that was a huge potential moneymaker for people like Floyd because it allowed him to advertise that this cave where tourists could go explore was full of all this rich history. And so Floyd eventually, after catching his breath in this little spot, got back down onto his stomach with his hands out in front of him with the lamp out ahead of his fingers, and he began going deeper and deeper into this unexplored section of Sand Cave. And as he inched along, even though the ceiling remained very tight on top of him, he's totally compressed to the ground, the walls on either side of him began to expand, which meant Floyd, if he wanted to, could actually turn himself around, although he couldn't stand up. And so Floyd is making his way down this very low ceiling area when he notices his oil lamp is beginning to flicker, which means it's going to go out soon. Now, Floyd wasn't concerned about suddenly being in the darkness inside of a cave. Now, to most people, that would be terrifying, but Floyd, again, was so experienced, he was very confident that he could easily make his way out again just by touch. He didn't need the light. But he did know that trying to move around inside of a cave in the darkness was dangerous, and so he should not do that if he could avoid it. And so as much as Floyd wanted to continue and hopefully find something incredible inside of this cave, he decided he really needed to just turn around and go back to the surface and come back the next day to continue exploring. And so, because this part of the tunnel he was in was really wide, he was able to turn himself around and drag his lamp until he was facing back uphill, and then he rolled onto his back. So his head is pointing back up where he came from, and his feet are pointing in the direction that he had previously been traveling, and he's on his back. And so his oil lamp is above his head. He can move his arms side to side because, again, it's pretty wide in the area he's in, but his head is pretty restricted by the ceiling. And he began inching with his heels and pushing with his arms, moving up the tunnel on his back. And as he would move, he'd use his head and his hands to push the oil lamp back up the direction he was going. And for a little while, this system worked great. But at some point, right as he was getting close to that area where he was able to previously get on his hands and knees and catch his breath, Floyd accidentally kind of rushed and pushed his lamp too hard and knocked it over, which extinguished the light. And so suddenly, Floyd was cast into total darkness. Now, again, Floyd was not concerned or really even scared about being in darkness inside of this cave, but this was not a good scenario and he knew it. But he told himself, stay calm. He knew where he was in the cave. He just needed to get to that little pocket. He'd catch his breath, and then he'd continue his way back up, eventually reach that hole in the ceiling, that square hole. He'd climb out, make his way out of the cave, and boom, he'd be done. And so Floyd just continued to push the now extinguished oil lamp above his head, and he continued to inch with his heels and moved his arms around to keep going backwards up this tunnel. But then, right before Floyd reached that pocket inside of the tunnel where he could get onto his hands and knees, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere below him, kind of near his legs. Now it's pitch black, he can't see anything, and so Floyd just kind of held his breath and hoped that whatever was happening wouldn't affect him, but then he felt a shooting pain in his left leg. A 27-pound rock had broken loose from the low ceiling and landed on his left ankle. Now, at first, Floyd was actually relieved that the rock had landed only on his left leg. And in fact, his leg was actually kind of positioned in a depression on the floor of the cave. And so the rock didn't really hit his left ankle directly. It kind of like hit the ground and then leaned onto his left ankle. And his left ankle was kind of protected in the depression in the cave floor. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness it only landed on my ankle and not on my head or my chest, because then I'd be dead. And so, after catching his breath and kind of calming down, Floyd tensed his body and pulled his left leg as hard as he could to clear this 27-pound rock, but his foot wouldn't budge. And so, Floyd thought he would just reach down and kind of dig his foot out. He'd just move the rock out of the way. But even though this cave had widened out on either side of Floyd when he had gone deeper and deeper into it, because he had retraced his steps, he was farther up the tunnel where those sides had really come in much closer to him. And so he wasn't able to actually reach down and touch the rock. The walls made it impossible. And so he wasn't able to use his hands to clear this rock. And so Floyd is pinned underground, unable to move, in absolute pitch darkness inside of a cave that's practically crushing his chest because the ceiling is so low, and he knows it's unstable. The ceiling has now fallen off, so there's a chance more rocks could come in at any time. I mean, this is like a worst case scenario for anybody who goes caving. But Floyd told himself to just stay calm. He knew this was a very bad situation, but people were certain to find out he was missing, and they knew he had gone to Sand Cave, and they would come here, they would find him, and they would rescue him. And so Floyd just decided he would wait. And for an agonizing 30 hours, remember, 30 hours of pitch blackness trapped in a totally claustrophobic environment. 30 hours of this, no food, no water, can't go to the bathroom. He's laying there for 30 hours, and then finally he hears a voice coming from somewhere near the entrance of this cave. And when he heard that voice, it was like the sweetest sound he had ever heard. Because not only did they represent help, but the voice was coming from Floyd's brother, Homer, who was also a very experienced caver. And so Floyd's thinking, thank goodness I'm saved. And so Homer was able to navigate from the entrance down all the way to the tunnel that Floyd was in. And Homer got to that spot in the tunnel where Floyd had gone to his hands and knees, that pocket there. So Homer's in that pocket, and he can see Floyd is only a few feet away from him. He can see Floyd's head right there. And so Homer, who had a lamp, he shines the light on Floyd, and the two brothers don't waste any time with small talk. Instead, Homer, who had his oil lamp, had set it up right next to them, and he began feeding Floyd sausage sandwiches and giving him sips of water. And then Homer would tell Floyd that he just did not have the equipment to help Floyd get out right now, but Homer was going to go back to the surface, get men, get supplies, and then come back and save Floyd. And so Floyd is very thankful, he's very relieved, he says goodbye to Homer, and Homer turns and makes his way back up to the surface. 15 hours later, Homer would return by himself, and so at this point, Floyd has been trapped for 45 hours. And so Floyd, he's laying there kind of in and out of consciousness, and he hears the sound of Homer calling out to him, and then he hears the sound of Homer chiseling away at some rocks. It would turn out Homer's plan to save Floyd was basically to chisel away the side of this section of tunnel that Floyd was stuck in order to be able to reach down and somehow, some way, clear the rock off of Floyd's leg and then pull Floyd up. Now, Floyd understood, of course, that this plan of chiseling away the side of this tunnel to make it wider was going to take some time, but luckily Homer had shown up with more food and water, and they chatted the whole time as Homer worked, and so Floyd was in good spirits, and Homer was very optimistic. But after 8 hours of Homer slowly chiseling his way, widening this tunnel, he hadn't made much progress, and he was totally exhausted. I mean, you gotta remember that the angle he was working at was horrible. He was basically crouched down on his hands and knees, chipping away at this rock. And so after those 8 hours, Homer would leave Floyd and go back home and sleep and eat and drink and kind of recover. But he told Floyd, don't worry, tomorrow more men will be here to help chisel away this tunnel and get Floyd out of there. But over the course of the next 50 hours, Floyd remained trapped inside of this tunnel with the rock pinning his leg, and despite Homer and several other men getting down there and very diligently chipping away at this tunnel, it just was not happening very quickly. And so over the course of those 50 hours, Homer began going in and out of consciousness, and he began not being able to differentiate between what was real and what was not. At one point, he would say that he believed the cave had kind of opened up and these angels riding golden chariots with flaming wheels had come in to save him. And as they were lifting him out of the cave, he smelled food and coffee. And then suddenly his hallucination cleared and he realized he was trapped in the darkness all alone, still in this cave. And it was like it destroyed his morale. And so Floyd is really starting to go downhill, and the rescuers are realizing they need to do something, and they need to do something now. But at the 130-hour mark, things got even worse for Floyd. As he was laying there in the tunnel, this was sometime in the middle of the night, and so no rescuers were actively down there trying to chisel their way down to him. He was laying there, and he was listening to the sound of the running water somewhere outside the cave, and that sound was kind of amplified down to him, and then all of a sudden, he heard the sound of falling rocks somewhere up above, and then when those rocks stopped and it went silent again, he could not hear the sound of the running water. It was very muffled. And that was when he realized that there must have been a cave-in somewhere higher up in the cave, which meant potentially there could be a significant block just to get down to him. Forget about widening this tunnel. I mean, he could be actually entombed inside of Sand Cave. And so Floyd did the only thing he could do, which was to pray. It would turn out that cave-in had indeed blocked the way for rescuers to get down to Floyd. And because of how extensive this cave-in was, the rescuers actually decided to start carving a brand new tunnel that would join up with the side of Floyd's tunnel. I mean, this is an even bigger undertaking than just chiseling the side of the tunnel that Floyd was in, which was their original plan and had taken several days. And so now they have to build this brand new tunnel to Floyd. And so finally, on February 16th, 1925, so a staggering 17 days from the time Floyd got first stuck in this cave, the rescue team finally punched through and reached Floyd. And as soon as they did, the lead rescuer looked over at Floyd, and then he paused, he turned up, and he just said, "Dead." It would turn out shortly after that cave-in, which sealed Floyd in completely inside of Sand Cave, at some point over the next couple of days, those rocks began to break free and tumble down the cave and began striking Floyd until finally one or several of those rocks hit him in the head or chest and killed him. So just imagine you are trapped. You've been there for several days. You're in total darkness. You're entombed inside of this cave. And periodically, rocks just come tumbling down and smash into you. Who knows how long it took to kill him, but that has to be one of the most agonizing ways to go ever.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do